After our amazing trip to Mozambique in 2006, we all agreed that we should take another trip in December 2007. If you haven't seen our trip to Mozambique, please make use of the link in the comments below to see why we enjoyed that trip so much. After much deliberation, we agreed to go to Botswana, through the central Kalahari Game Reserve, and then on up to Moremi and Chobe. And on an impulse, we crossed into Zambia to see the Victoria waterfalls before heading home. Donovan's trusty 2.2-litre petrol Hilux that had made the trip to Mozambique with us joined us on this one again, and being the only petrol vehicle in our group actually saved us. Christu and Sylvia still had their 2.8 turbo diesel Mitsubishi that had made it through Mozambique, and joining them was Christu's brother, Hannes. Kevin and Beatrice joined us with their 3-litre KZT Toyota Hilux. With them was a friend, Jock. Fritz and Marlette, in their 2.5-litre turbo diesel Ford Ranger, also joined us on this trip. After our 2006 trip to Mozambique, my wife and I sold our 109-inch Land Rover, and we upgraded to a 2.5 turbo diesel Ford Ranger. Zach decided that his 88-inch Land Rover was not going to make it on this trip to Botswana, so he and Alida joined us in our Ford Ranger. Our first day's trip would take us from Pretoria to the Pioneer Gate where we crossed into Botswana. From there we went via Gaborone up to Kutse. So on Friday the 14th of December after work, we made our way back home and we started packing our bags. And that took most of the evening, and in the early hours we finally headed off for a little bit of rest. And the next morning at 5 a.m, bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, we met up at a local gas station, where we filled up with fuel and then set off for our long trip. We made a quick stop in Zeerust before heading off to the border post. We joined the long line of vehicles and slowly inched forward until we were able to go in and have our passports stamped. Gaborone would be the last major city that we passed through, so we stopped to make sure that we had all of our last-minute supplies and stretch our legs before we continued north. We stopped at the very last gas station before the central Kalahari Game Reserve. We knew we could only carry just enough diesel and gas to get us to the next filling station, which was on the other side of the central Kalahari Game Reserve. So we made sure to brim our tanks and fill our jerry cans. From here on out we'd be driving through thick sand, so we all deflated our tires before setting on out to Kutse. If a sand road in Botswana is regularly used and maintained, it will normally have a very wide median, which means you could slide all over the place without getting into oncoming traffic. Donkeys are a real danger on Botswana roads, and you will find them everywhere you go, but they seem to be especially prevalent on the sand roads. We arrived at the Kutse Game Reserve gate in the late afternoon. The maximum temperature for the day had been up to 120 F, and we were glad to have it a lot cooler than that. While waiting to pay for our camping, we found a host of interesting bugs and insects. After the rain, the springbok were out for their evening graze. We quickly set up our campsite and then went on an excursion to find some firewood, which is something we would do regularly every evening at a new campsite. The ablution facilities were very well maintained, You had a bucket for a shower, a long drop for a toilet, and very clear signage to show you when it was occupied. And if the signs in the ablution block failed, you could just look underneath and see if there were feet. We enjoyed the beautiful African sunset before lighting the campfire and then sitting down to enjoy our evening. Our second day would take us from Kutse north to Bape, a trip of only 100 miles, which was supposed to be 11 hours of grueling, low-range, thick sand. Fortunately, it had rained, and the wet sand made for easy driving. Dawn broke over the African savanna, and in our campsite, last night's insects scurried off to find shelter for the day. After emerging from our tents, we started our morning with coffee and rusks. Dishes had to be washed, tents packed, and our vehicles loaded. Donovan's Hilux's engine insisted that we all stand around and admire it for a little while before it could get started for the day. The last thing we did was to make sure that the campfire was properly extinguished before we climbed into our vehicles to start the day's drive. Zuck decided that he would be more comfortable traveling on the roof of the Ranger, but we were pretty sure it's because he just wanted to smoke his pipe. The small tracks wound their way through the bush, and every now and again would open up to a pan, where we were able to see various different animals. The thorn trees had overgrown the narrow sand tracks, and we had to make peace with the fact that our vehicles were going to get scratched. Every time we went past one of the thorn trees, they screeched down the paintwork as we passed by them. We found our first gemsbok or oryx, and we would see many more of them on the trip. We were excited to see a Kori bustard, which is the largest known flying bird and has up to a 9-foot wingspan. This area is usually dry and arid, and with the rain that they'd been having, nature had responded with the most beautiful flowers showing up all over the place. We passed by quite a few of these deserted settlements on our way. We stopped at a dead tree to take some photographs, and Donovan and Christu thought that they would play the Karate Kid and see who would win the rights to have the horns. The victor of the horns proudly mounted them on the front of their Toyota. The heat of the day had started drying out some parts of the road, and every now and again the sand would start getting a little thicker again. We arrived at the signboard that indicated the Bape campsite, but we couldn't find any campsite, and so we assumed that you had to choose your tree and make your camp under the tree. There was a huge thunderstorm passing on the horizon, and so we quickly set up our tents so that we had a place to shelter. Fortunately, there was only a light shower of rain, and we were able to continue making our camp. As there was no ablution facilities, the first thing we needed to do was choose a suitable location and get hunters going with digging a hole. With the location and hole size approved, privacy shielding had to be erected. And once checked, the privacy shielding was adjusted and then signed off by the quality inspector. Next up, a shower site was selected and ropes installed in order to lift the shower bags. Once again, suitable privacy shielding was set up. In order to make our lives a little easier, we set up a faucet connected to a water tank in the back of the pickup. With the basics in place, Donovan set out to collect firewood, while Christu started chopping up a nearby log. The wet firewood made lighting the fire a little difficult, but we soon had a good campfire going and could turn our attention to supper. The sunset tonight was spectacular. Shades of pink and orange, with a silhouette of trees superimposed in front of it. Today's trip would take us due west, a straight line from the Bape campsite to the Sade campsite. The morning started with us washing the dishes, and then we packed up our campsite before hitting the road to the west. Wild dogs are an endangered species in Africa, and we were very fortunate to find this pack right alongside the road as we travelled. Where there's wild dogs, there's bound to be vultures, and they were circling overhead and sitting in the trees. During one of our stops, we found a tortoise hiding in between the bushes. Alida had had enough of being stuck inside the pickup, so she took her turn on the roof. It was time for lunch, and we stopped in the middle of the road. As there was no shade, we put up the gazebo in the middle of the road. Today's menu was hamburgers, which we grilled in the middle of the road under our gazebo. After lunch, we found a section of road covered in worms. The hawks were enjoying a free lunch and picking off the worms. The dry sand on the sand track made for slow going, and we were grinding away in low range for most of the day. For the first time in 2 days, we encountered travelers going in the opposite direction. The problem with the sand tracks is it was not easy to allow other vehicles past, and with great effort we were able to pull off the road to allow them to pass. The further west we went, the more rain they had, and as we approached Sadi, the big water puddles started appearing in the road. It was great fun splashing through the water after a day's driving in the dry sand. We finally reached Tsade and quickly set up our camp. We then enjoyed the nice warm showers at the local ablution facility. A yellow-billed hornbill joined us in our campsite and carefully overlooked everything that we were doing. During the day's drive, Christo had noticed a grinding noise coming from his front wheel. And that evening we opened it up to see what it was and found a shattered CV joint. Christo made the decision to continue even though he would only be able to use 4x2 for the rest of the trip. We collected firewood, then got the campfire going, and enjoyed a calm evening. We had a good laugh at Alida, whose pants had torn, and because she couldn't sew, she talked Donovan into sewing them up for her. We ended the evening as a group of friends, enjoying an African campfire. Today's trip would take us from Sadi campsites north to Kori campsites, and it involved some thick mud and ended with us almost being eaten by lions. After a good breakfast, we broke camp and loaded up the vehicles. Our friendly hornbill stopped to say goodbye as we were leaving. The roads leading out of Sade seemed almost too good to be true, and as usually the case when things seemed too good to be true, we found that we were on a detour. So we made a U-turn and headed back on these good roads. The road we were supposed to be on was a small dirt track, and that soon led us to mud. The road started getting more and more muddy until we reached this section where we thought we were going to get stuck. As my Ranger was the only one that had mud terrain tires, it was decided that I would go first, and the ruts were so deep that my rear bumper caught on the side and plowed up the grass. You can still see some of the grass hanging out of the left-hand corner. Kevin made ample use of the Hilux's skinny pedal, and the diesel engine moaned as it dragged itself through the thick mud. Donovan's little petrol engine screamed as it dragged the Hilux slowly but steadily through the thick mud. There was lots of animals out grazing. We saw many gemsbok, wildebeest and springbok.
At the next muddy spot, Fritz went first, using momentum to get his Ranger through. For lunch, we decided to take it slow, and again stopped our vehicles in the middle of the sand track, right near a big shady tree. So we took out the camping chairs and got our lunch stuff out, and had a nice relaxing lunch sitting under the shade trees. After lunch, we saw many animals. Gemsbok,
secretary birds,
more springbok,
Batelier eagle, even one taking a bath.
and for the first time in this trip, we saw lots of giraffe. We also saw quite a few more Kori bustards. The road was a mixture of being dry and dusty, and then the thick black mud. The mud had very deep ruts, which made for very bumpy driving. Kevin and Beatrice happened to have a camera on when they went through one of the mud patches.
Wat kop so? Yes.
We arrived at our campsite and quickly set up our camp.
As usual at a new campsite, we had to go and collect firewood. Tonight it was Fritz and my turn to do this, and we set off through the veld, talking and laughing. I noticed a small movement in the bush, and said to Fritz, "Look, there's a baboon." We quickly realized that it wasn't a baboon, but a lion. And as we looked, we saw two more. Fear shot up and down our spines. Fritz asked, "What should we do?" We decided not to run, but took a few quick steps backwards. One of the lions rushed forward and crouched in a hunting position. We had walked into a pride of lions. The three we saw first were younger lions that were learning how to hunt. We slowly took a step backwards, while the lions stepped forward. We stepped back again, and they crouched forward. And so we slowly backed all the way to the campsite, where we warned everyone. They didn't believe us at first, but quickly joined us as we jumped into the pickups. Safely in our pickups, we followed the lions as they went through our camp and down into the pans to hunt, where that night they made a kill.
Nature treated us to another magical sunset, this time with the sound of lions roaring in the background. After all the excitement, we set about somewhat cautiously in having our braai that evening. Jock, on the other hand, threw caution to the wind and caught a snake, and later found a scorpion. For the last 4 days we had been making camp every evening and breaking camp every single morning, which is really exhausting. So we decided to take the day off and stay at the Kalahari campsites. Donovan tested out the ablution facilities, while the rest of us made coffee. It was rather a cold morning, and we huddled around the gas flame as we made ourselves brunch. That evening we took a game drive, and even the springbok were cold and huddled up. The only animal out and about was this black-backed jackal. Now, jackal is a very scarce animal to see, especially during the daylight, and we were very lucky to see this one.
We were able to get nice and close to this brightly coloured and very noisy koran. With last night's lion still fresh in our memory, we made a larger than normal campfire, with potjie and curry and rice for supper. Today's trip would take us from Kalahari campsites to Rockops, where we would be able to refuel for the first time in just less than a week. From Rockops we would continue northwest to Maun.
We packed up our campsite and headed to the Matsweri gate, where we left the Central Kalahari Game Reserve. While we were outside the game reserve, we were still very rural area, and we continued on sand tracks till we eventually hit the tar road. Rockops is a very small rural town, with only one filling station. But as we hadn't had any diesel or gas for almost a week, we were overjoyed to pull up next to the fuel pumps. It was with shock and horror that they informed us that they did not have any diesel in Rockops, only petrol or gasoline. The next diesel was only available 130 miles away in Maun, and we knew that it was unlikely that we would have enough to make it all the way. We had what little diesel was left in our tanks and one full jerry can. Donovan had a full tank of gas, and we knew he could make the 130 miles to Maun, but it was unlikely that we would all make it. So we decided to do the only thing that we could. We set off slowly, and the first person to run out would get a quarter of the jerry can. The next person to run out of diesel would get another next quarter of the jerry can. So we decided to risk it and head north. If we did run out of diesel, the plan was to load all the jerry cans into Donovan's petrol Hilux, and he would have to make the rest of the trip to Maun to get diesel and then come back and fill our tanks. We stopped at every place we could along the road to see if they had diesel, and none of them had, and so inevitably we had to do the roadside stop and start rationing out the last little bit of diesel that we had. With our pickup truck starting to lurch and jerk from running out of diesel, we managed to just make it into Maun and found a filling station that had diesel, We were overjoyed to be able to fill up once again and made sure that all of our jerry cans were full as well. We headed to a few stores in Mount to stock up on supplies. The next day we were traveling to the Okavango and would not be able to resupply for a few days, so we made sure to stock up on all of the necessities. We did not have a campsite booked for that night, and so there was a lot of begging and pleading at different campsites until eventually we found a place where they would allow us to stay overnight. We couldn't resist taking photographs at this huge termite mound near the campsite. Being in the civilization for the first time in a week, we decided to let loose and partied late in the evening. Join us in the next episode as we travel through the Okavango Delta and then get hopelessly lost and have to spend the night in the middle of nowhere.
Stay tuned, or better yet subscribe for more videos of the road less explored.